My name is Denise Gallagher, and I'm an illustrator. And I'm extremely proud to be named a finalist in the Lillian Shepherd Memorial Award for Excellence in Illustration in the Atlantic Book Awards 2020 for the work that I did for Peg Bearskin, published by Running the Goat Press. Peg Bearskin was such a joy to illustrate. As you'll see, I'm going to read it to you now. Peg Bearskin, a Traditional Newfoundland Tale, adapted by Philip Dinn and Andy Jones, with Mercedes Berry, from a tale told by Mrs. Elizabeth Brewer and collected by Harold Healy, illustrated by Denise Gallagher. One time, in olden times, not in my time, there was a man and a woman, and they got married, and they never had any children. They were a long while and never had no children, and, well, her husband, he was real nasty to her. So one day the woman was out sitting down in the door, and she was crying. And this old man came along, and he asked her what was she crying about. Well, she said, I'm married a long time now, she said, and I never had any children. And she said, me husband is real nasty to me. Well, he said, you see that tree now that's growing over there in the yard? Now tomorrow morning, he said, when you gets up, there'll be 3 berries on that tree. He said, you eat 2. Now there'll be one as sweet as molasses, and there'll be one as sweet as sugar. But there'll be one, he said, that'll be bitter as the gall. Don't eat the one that's bitter as the gall. So all right, she gets up the next morning and she looked out, and sure enough, there were 3 berries on the tree. So she went out and she ate the one, and it was sweet as sugar. Then she ate the other one, and it was sweet as molasses. She looked at the other one for a while, and well, she said she'd eat that one too, but it was bitter as the gall. So 9 months later, she had 3 children, and they were 3 girls. There were 2. Oh, they were as pretty as ever the sun shined on. But there was one that was big, ugly, and hairy, and they called that one Peg Bearskin. Now the 3 girls, they grew up together, but nobody liked Peg. Nobody. Whatever way it was. And her sisters, well, they were getting kind of fed up with her for some way or another. And they said to the mother, they said they were going away, they said, unknown to Peg, 'cause they said they didn't want her going with them. So they went. Now Peg, she soon found out they were going, and she said, well, she said she was going too. So she went and she followed them. Now the sisters were walking along, and all of a sudden they heard a big noise coming behind them. Oh no, they said, that's Peg. And they looked around, and sure enough, there was Peg coming up the rear. They tried to make her go back. She wouldn't go back. They threw rocks at her and all that. She still wouldn't go back. So they had to let her go on with them. So they were walking along, and it was getting almost dark when they saw this little hut of a house. So they said, we'll go over there now and see if we can spend the night. So they went over and knocked on the door, and this little old woman came out. And Peg said, we're looking for a place to spend the night. Can you put us up? And the old lady said, well, she said, I only got the 3 beds, and I got me 2 daughters. I can keep 2 of you, she said, but I can't keep 3. And Peg said, well, she said, it don't make no matter to meself where I goes, long as I got a place for me 2 sisters. Well, said the old woman, I suppose I'll keep the 3 of you then. So they went in, and later they all had to go to bed now, and Peg lay down on the floor. But she couldn't sleep. She twisted and turned all night, just couldn't get to sleep. There was something bad about that place. She could feel it right down into her bones. So she got up and she walked around the old woman's house. Now she soon knew that the old woman was a witch, for in her kitchen she found a decanter that could never be emptied. She poured wine into it, turned it upside down, the wine flowed and flowed and flowed. Water, same thing. Milk, same thing. Flowed and flowed, never stopped. Then, out in the barn, she found a lantern that could shine a half a mile light. You didn't have to fill it, you didn't have to light it. All you had to do was touch it, and it shone for half a mile. And touch it Peg did, and it shone for half a mile. And it shone onto a beautiful white horse, with a golden bell from every hair onto his mane. And each bell was magic, and anyone who'd ring a bell could make a wish, and it'd come true, as long as you didn't wish for anything too big or too small. And the trick was, you had to ride him first. Now her sisters are upstairs asleep, and Peg begins to worry, for the old witch had put nightcaps on her sisters' heads. So Peg went up and she took the nightcaps off her sisters' heads, and she put them on the witch's daughters' heads. So later, when the old woman got up to kill Peg's 2 sisters, she went over to where the 2 with the nightcaps on were, and she killed them. But they were her own 2 daughters. So quick as a wink, Peg ran to her sisters and she said, "Let's get out of here so fast as ever we can." And they ran and they ran and they got as fast and far away from that witch as ever they could. Well now, after a while, Peg's two sisters, they got jobs doing something or other. I don't know what Peg was at all the time, but there was a king there and he had 3 sons. Now one day, Peg minded that she was going to go and see the king. She walked up to the palace gate and the guard asked her what did she want. "Well," she says, "I wants to see the king." So all right, the king was satisfied for her to come and see him, whatever way it was. And she went in and he said, "Well, Peg," he said, "what can I do for you?" "Well, me highness," she said, "I wants to know if you'd be satisfied for your oldest son to marry my oldest sister. And," she said, "I'll bring you a canter that can never be emptied." "Well," he said, "that'd be a handy thing for a king." So he gave consent, and he said, "Now, Peg, what would you want for to get that?" And she said, "All I want is a handful of pepper." So all right, he gives her the handful of pepper, and away she goes, back to the old witch's house. Now the witch's old man was there, eating his dinner, and when he finished, he called for the old woman to bring in his decanter. She brought it out, and he put it on his head, and he was drinking and drinking and drinking. So that's when Peg took the handful of pepper, and she threw it at him, and he was sneezing and coughing and coughing and sneezing and coughing and all that. Peg grabbed the decanter, and she took it to the king, and the king's oldest son and Peg's oldest sister were married. So after a while, Peg minded she was going to go back and see the king again. So she went in, and he said, "Well, what can I do for you now, Peg?" "Well, me highness," she said, "I wants to know if you'd be satisfied for your second oldest son to marry my second oldest sister." And she said, "I'll bring you a lantern that can shine a half a mile light. You don't have to fill it, you don't have to light it, all you've got to do is touch it, and it shines for half a mile." "Well," he said, "that'd be a handy thing for a king." So he gave consent, and he said, "Now, Peg, what would you want to get that?" And she said, "All I'd want is a handful of salt." So Peg's hand could hold a whole hogshead of salt. So he gives her the salt, and away she goes, back to the old witch's house. Now the old witch was there, and she was making a bit of soup. So Peg snuck into the kitchen and hid. Now the old woman tasted the soup and found it was too fresh. And when she turned to get a bit of salt to go in it, that's when Peg let the whole hogshead of salt drop down into the soup. So when the old witch tasted it, it was too salty. She called for the servant girl to go to the well to get her some water. Now it was 1 mile to the well, so the foolish servant girl hung the lantern onto the porch, walked for half a mile, and got lost in the dark. So Peg grabbed the lantern, and she took it to the king, and the king's second oldest son and Peg's second oldest sister were married. After a while, Peg minded that she was going to go back and see the king again. So she went in, and he said, "Now, Peg, what can I do for you today?" "Well, me highness," she said, "I wants to know," she said, "if you'd be satisfied for your youngest son to marry me." Well, the king did not like that, no siree, not one little bit. But Peg said, "I will bring you a horse that can go 10 times swifter than a cannonball." And she said, "There's a golden bell from every hair onto his mane, and each bell is magic. And if you ring a bell, you can make a wish, and it will come true as long as you wish for neither anything too big nor too small." Well, he said, that would be handy for a king. So he thought and he thought about it, and after a while he gave consent. And he said, "Well, now, Peg, what would you want for to get that?" And she said, "All I wants is a knife and a saw." So very good, he gives her the knife and he gives her the saw, and away she goes back to the old witch's house for the 3rd time. She walks up to the door bold as brass, knocks, and the old woman comes out. "Well, Peg, you come," she said. "You were the cause of me killing me 2 daughters. You took my canter that could never be emptied. You stole me lantern that could shine a half-mile light. Now, Peg, if I did that to you, what would you do to me?" "Well," Peg said, "I'd take you and stuff you down in a bag. Then I'd take you to the side of the road, and I'd leave you there, and I'd go off into the woods, and I'd cut some hazel rods, and I'd come out, and I'd beat you, till you meowed like a cat, till you barked like a dog, until your bones rattled like crockery ware." "Well," said the old witch, "that's what I'll do to you, Peg. Ha ha." So she got Peg, and she stuffed her down into the bag, and took her to the side of the road, left her there, and went off into the woods to get the hazel rods. But when she did, Peg took the knife that the king had given her, ripped open the bag, and went back to the witch's house, took her dog, her cat, and her crockery ware, stuffed them into the bag, brought it back to the side of the road, left it there, went back to the old woman's barn, took the witch's horse, and went on. So the old woman, she came out of the woods, and she picked up the hazel rods, and she beat the bag, and she hit the cat, and the cat meowed, and she hit the dog, and the dog barked, and she hit the crockery ware till it rattled. "Well, Peg," she said, "your words come true." And away she went back to her house, and when she got there, she found that her cat was gone, her dog was gone, and her crockery ware was gone. So she went out into the stable to get her horse, and the horse was gone. But luckily, she had another one that could go almost as fast. So she took that one, and she went after Peg. Now, to get across the river, you had to go over a bridge. And when Peg got to the other side of the bridge, she took the saw the king had given her, and she sawed it in two. So when the old witch come on the horse to go after Peg, the bridge gave way, and she went way out into the river. And as soon as ever the water touched her, she melted. This is a common thing for witches. So all right, Peg took the magic horse, and she brought it to the king, so he had no choice. He had to let his youngest son marry her. But the prince, well, he was never happy. No, he was crying all the time. And poor Peg, oh my, she was some sad, sad beyond words. And one day, she was looking out her window in the palace. She looked down in the garden, and there was her own husband, with the tears running down his cheeks. She went down to him, and she said, "You don't want me, do you?" "No, girl," he said, "I don't." "Well," she said, "I'll tell you a secret. That horse that I brought to your father is a magic horse. And," she said, "if you can ride him, you can ring one of the bells on his mane and make a wish, and it will come true. But you must wish for nothing, neither anything too big nor too small." "Could I wish for you to be beautiful?" he said. "You could try," said Peg. So that's what the prince did. He rode that horse no problem. Oh, he was a dandy rider. And sure enough, he rang the bell, and he wished for Peg to be beautiful. And then he rushed to her room in the castle, and there she stood just as big, ugly, and hairy as ever. And she said, "Do you like me now?" And he said, "Peg, you are the most beautiful woman that water ever wet, or the sun ever shined on." And she said, "And you, my darling prince, are more handsome than ever." For lo and behold, the prince had become just as big, ugly, and hairy as Peg. So that was his wife then, and they stayed together, and their happy days were as happy as the happiest days that anyone ever had. And luckily, their sad days were never as sad as the saddest days that some of us have. And that is the end of my story. And I'd like to dedicate this story to my true loves, Donnie, Zooey, and Oliver. And to all you brave and clever Pegs out there, I say, wear your bearskins proudly. Thank you.